You're enjoying a quiet Saturday morning when three men in pseudo-police uniforms show up at your door, claiming they're here to arrest you for HOA violations. They've got fake badges, clipboards full of citations, and the audacity to threaten handcuffs over your grass being half an inch too tall. The HOA president stands behind them, smirking like she's just played her ace card. But here's what she doesn't know. I'm Gabriel Carter, and I have been the police chief of this town for the past 8 years. This is the story of how Victoria Collins, our power-hungry HOA president, tried to intimidate the wrong homeowner and ended up exposing a criminal conspiracy that went far deeper than anyone imagined. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from today. My name is Gabriel Carter, and I've called Willowbrook Heights home for 3 years now. It's one of those picture-perfect suburban communities where every lawn looks like it belongs on a magazine cover and every mailbox is regulation height. I bought my house here specifically because it was quiet, safe, and close to the precinct where I serve as police chief. After 22 years in law enforcement, I thought I'd finally found my peaceful retreat. That was before I met Victoria Collins. Victoria became our HOA president about 18 months ago, and from day one, she ran the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom. The woman had a measuring tape permanently attached to her belt and could spot a dandelion from 3 houses away. But her obsession went beyond normal HOA oversight. She seemed to take personal pleasure in finding violations and issuing fines. The first time she cited me was for having my garbage cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. The fine was $50. The second time was for my mailbox being 0.3 degrees off perpendicular alignment with the curb. Another $50 fine. By my count, she'd issued me 17 citations in 6 months, totaling $1,200 in penalties for infractions so minor they wouldn't hold up in traffic court. I kept my profession private in the neighborhood. After dealing with criminals, court cases, and department politics all day, I wanted home to be a sanctuary where I was just Gabriel, not Chief Carter. I drove an unmarked personal vehicle, kept my uniform in the garage, and rarely discussed work with neighbors. It wasn't secrecy, it was self-preservation. But my anonymity was about to become Victoria's biggest mistake. The harassment escalated 3 weeks ago when she issued a final notice about my lawn height. According to her digital measurements, yes, she had a laser measuring device, my grass was 2.7 inches tall. HOA regulations specified a maximum of 2.5 inches. She gave me 48 hours to remedy the violation or face escalated enforcement actions. I'd had enough. That evening, I decided to do what I should have done months earlier. Investigate Victoria Collins the way I'd investigate any other person abusing authority. What I discovered made my blood boil. Victoria had been systematically targeting specific homeowners while completely ignoring violations by others. Mrs. Henderson at the end of the block had a garden gnome collection that violated at least 6 aesthetic guidelines, but had never received a single citation. The Johnsons had been parking their RV in their driveway for 8 months, a clear violation, but Victoria consistently looked the other way. The pattern became clear when I cross-referenced the targeted homeowners. We were all newer residents, all homeowners without personal connections to Victoria, and coincidentally, we all lived in the more expensive section of the development. Meanwhile, her friends and longtime neighbors could violate regulations with impunity. But the real bombshell came when I accessed public records on HOA finances. As police chief, I had legitimate access to investigate potential fraud, and what I found was stunning. Over the past 18 months, Victoria had collected nearly $47,000 in fines from selective enforcement. The HOA bylaws required fine money to go into a community improvement fund, but there was no record of these deposits. Instead, the money seemed to have vanished entirely. I was looking at systematic harassment combined with potential embezzlement. Victoria Collins wasn't just a power-hungry busybody. She was running a criminal enterprise disguised as HOA governance. My investigation was interrupted by a knock at my door last Tuesday evening. Victoria stood on my porch with two men I didn't recognize, both holding official-looking clipboards. "Mr. Carter," she said with barely concealed satisfaction, "these gentlemen are here to discuss your continued violations and your refusal to pay legally imposed fines." The taller man stepped forward. "Sir, I'm Officer Bradley with HOA Enforcement. We need to discuss your outstanding citations and potential legal consequences." I almost laughed. In 22 years of law enforcement, I'd never heard of HOA enforcement officers, and his badge looked like something from a costume shop. But I played along, curious to see how deep this rabbit hole went. "What exactly are you enforcing?" I asked. "Property maintenance violations, unpaid fines, and failure to comply with community standards," the second man replied. "We have authority to issue citations and, if necessary, coordinate with local law enforcement for warrant execution." They didn't have authority to do anything except impersonate officers, which was a felony. But I smiled and nodded, asking them to return Saturday morning to discuss payment arrangements. I needed time to document this properly and gather evidence of their fake credentials. Victoria was about to learn that some people can't be intimidated, especially when they're the ones who actually carry the badges. Saturday morning arrived with crystal clear weather and the kind of suburban quiet that makes you appreciate living in a good neighborhood. I was sipping coffee on my front porch at 9:15 a.m. when Victoria's little parade turned the corner onto my street. She walked with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the power, flanked by the same two fake officers from Tuesday, plus a third man I hadn't seen before. All three were wearing dark uniforms that looked official from a distance, but screamed costume shop up close. They had badges, utility belts, and even handcuffs hanging from their gear. But here's what made this truly remarkable. Victoria had invited an audience. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was walking her dog at exactly the right moment to witness my arrest. The Hendersons were conveniently checking their mailbox. Even Mr. Rodriguez was outside washing a car that looked spotless. This was theater, designed to humiliate me publicly and send a message to anyone else considering challenging Victoria's authority. I had my phone recording from the moment they stepped onto my property. "Gabriel Carter," Victoria announced loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, "you failed to comply with multiple lawful orders from the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. These officers are here to place you under citizen's arrest for violations of community standards and failure to pay legally imposed fines." The lead fake officer stepped forward with handcuffs visible. "Sir, you need to come with us. You have outstanding citations totaling $1,847, and failure to comply constitutes a breach of your homeowner agreement and local ordinances." I had to admire the specificity of their lies. They'd inflated my actual fines and created entirely fictional legal authority, but they delivered it with conviction. The handcuffs were a nice touch. Intimidation theater at its finest. "Officers," I said calmly, still recording, "could you please show me your credentials?" The tall one flashed his badge quickly. "I'm Officer Bradley, HOA Enforcement Division. This is Officer Martinez and Officer Thompson." "And what agency exactly employs you?" "We're contracted through the Metropolitan Housing Compliance Authority," Officer Bradley replied smoothly. "We work with local HOAs to enforce community standards." I nodded thoughtfully. "Could I see your peace officer certifications?" The three exchanged glances. Victoria stepped forward impatiently. "Gabriel, stop being difficult. These are legitimate officers executing legitimate enforcement action. You've ignored 17 citations, refused to pay imposed fines, and violated your homeowner agreement. Either come willingly or they'll arrest you for obstruction." "Ma'am," I said politely, "I don't think you understand the legal situation here." Officer Bradley reached for his handcuffs. "Sir, we're done talking. You're coming with us." That's when I decided the show had gone far enough. "Gentlemen," I said, standing up and pulling my actual badge from my pocket, "I'm Gabriel Carter, Chief of Police for this municipality. You're impersonating law enforcement officers, which is a third-degree felony. You're also trespassing on private property while making false claims of legal authority." The color drained from all four faces simultaneously. It was like watching someone pull the plug on their confidence. Additionally, I continued, my voice taking on the authority I use during arrests. You're wearing fake badges, making false claims about legal authority you don't possess, and attempting to unlawfully detain a citizen. Officer Bradley, that handcuff case you're reaching for, those aren't toy handcuffs, are they? Officer Bradley's hand froze halfway to his belt. No, sir. So you're carrying real restraints while impersonating officers and threatening to unlawfully detain citizens. That elevates this to aggravated impersonation, which carries a mandatory minimum sentence. Victoria found her voice first. This is ridiculous. You can't be a police chief? I would have known. Why would you have known, Victoria? Because you make it your business to know everything about your neighbors so you can better harass them. Did you think everyone in the neighborhood was required to report their profession to you? I pulled out my phone and dialed a number the fake officers recognized, the direct line to dispatch. This is Chief Carter. I need 3 patrol units at my residence for arrest warrants. We have 4 subjects for impersonating law enforcement officers, criminal trespass, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Officer Martinez tried to back away. Look, this was just a misunderstanding. We were just trying to help the HOA. Help them what? Commit felonies? Because that's what you've been doing. Victoria, did you pay these men to impersonate officers? Her silence was answer enough. And the HOA enforcement authority you mentioned? That doesn't exist, does it? You created fictional legal authority to intimidate residents into paying fines that you've been embezzling. By now, genuine police sirens were audible in the distance, and our audience of neighbors had grown considerably. But instead of witnessing my humiliation, they were about to see Victoria Collins and her fake officers taken away in real handcuffs by real police. Victoria, I said as 3 patrol cars rounded the corner, you picked the wrong house to mess with. The arrest scene was something straight out of a dark comedy. Victoria Collins, who had orchestrated this elaborate intimidation scheme, watched in stunned silence as her 3 fake officers were handcuffed by actual police officers and read their rights. The neighbors she'd invited to witness my humiliation instead saw her criminal enterprise collapse in spectacular fashion. Detective Sarah Martinez, one of my most capable investigators, took lead on the case. Within an hour of the arrests, she'd separated the 4 conspirators and begun documenting the scope of their operation. What we discovered over the following week was far more extensive than I'd initially suspected. The 3 fake officers weren't random actors Victoria had hired. They were part of an established scam operation. Brad Thompson, the leader, had been running fake officer schemes across 3 counties, targeting HOA disputes, tenant-landlord conflicts, and debt collection scenarios. For $200 per enforcement action, he and his team would show up in official-looking uniforms and intimidate people into compliance. Victoria had found them through a Craigslist ad advertising private enforcement services for property management companies. She'd paid them $600 to stage my arrest, believing the public humiliation would end any resistance to her authority and serve as a warning to other residents. But the fake officer scheme was just the tip of the iceberg. Detective Martinez's financial investigation revealed that Victoria had been systematically embezzling HOA funds for over 18 months. The $47,000 in selective fines was just part of it. She'd also been skimming from the Community Maintenance Fund, inflating contractor bills and pocketing the difference, and creating fake vendor invoices for services never provided. The total theft exceeded $89,000. Even worse, we discovered she'd been using HOA funds to pay for her fake officer schemes against other residents. Mrs. Chen had been targeted 6 months ago for having unauthorized outdoor decorations, meaning the small Buddha statue in her garden. Victoria had paid Thompson's crew $400 to show up and threaten Mrs. Chen with arrest for cultural violations of community standards. 72-year-old Mrs. Chen had been so terrified by the fake officers that she'd removed the statue and paid $800 in fabricated fines rather than risk jail time. When Detective Martinez interviewed her, Mrs. Chen broke down crying, describing months of anxiety and fear that she'd somehow become a criminal for honoring her cultural traditions. The pattern extended to 8 other residents over the past year. Victoria had weaponized fake law enforcement to terrorize her own neighbors into compliance, targeting anyone who questioned her authority or belonged to demographic groups she considered problematic. Mr. James Washington, a retired veteran, had been threatened with arrest for flying an American flag that was improperly proportioned for residential display. The Martinez family had been told their children's bicycles constituted recreational equipment violations, requiring immediate removal or criminal charges. Young couple Sarah and Mike Connor had been intimidated into removing a small pride flag from their window after fake officers claimed it violated political display ordinances. Each incident had been carefully designed to target residents Victoria perceived as different, difficult, or defiant. She had created a reign of terror disguised as community standards enforcement. But Victoria's biggest mistake was targeting people in my neighborhood without realizing that several residents had connections to law enforcement. Mr. Washington, the veteran she'd harassed about his flag, was a retired military police officer who'd found the fake officers suspicious, but hadn't wanted to cause trouble. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been walking her dog during my arrest, was married to a county court judge who'd been wondering about the legal validity of some HOA enforcement tactics. As word spread about Victoria's arrest and the fake officer scheme, residents began coming forward with their own experiences. The scope of her intimidation campaign was staggering. Detective Martinez also uncovered Victoria's personal motivations through social media analysis and neighbor interviews. Victoria had bought her house in Willowbrook Heights 15 years ago when the neighborhood was more affordable and diverse. As property values rose and new residents moved in, residents with higher incomes, different backgrounds, and less willingness to tolerate authoritarian control, Victoria had become increasingly resentful. Her selective enforcement wasn't just about money or power. It was about driving out residents she considered incompatible with her neighborhood vision. The fake officers were her attempt to use fear and intimidation to maintain control over a community that was naturally evolving beyond her comfort zone. The legal consequences were swift and severe. Victoria was charged with embezzlement, conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement officers, criminal trespass, extortion, and hate crime enhancements for targeting residents based on race, religion, and sexual orientation. The fake officers faced multiple felony charges across several jurisdictions. As Detective Martinez discovered, they'd been operating similar schemes in neighboring towns. But the most satisfying part of the investigation wasn't the criminal charges. It was watching the community rally together once Victoria's reign of terror ended. Neighbors who'd been living in fear began talking to each other, sharing stories, and realizing they weren't alone in being targeted. Mrs. Chen reinstalled her Buddha statue, this time accompanied by a beautiful garden that neighbors helped her design. Mr. Washington's flag flew proudly without threat of fake arrest. The Martinez children's bicycles returned to the front yard where kids' bikes belong. The real healing, though, was just beginning. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my backyard watching my neighbors enjoy the 4th of July block party we organized to celebrate our community's transformation. Mrs. Chen is teaching kids how to fold paper cranes near her restored garden. Mr. Washington is grilling burgers while telling stories about his military service. The Martinez family brought homemade tamales that disappeared within an hour. Sarah and Mike Connor are setting up lawn games, their pride flag hanging peacefully from their front porch. Victoria Collins is currently serving a 4-year sentence for embezzlement and conspiracy charges. The fake officer crew received sentences ranging from 2 to 6 years, with Brad Thompson facing additional charges in 3 other counties. The judge specifically noted that targeting elderly and minority residents with fake law enforcement constituted domestic terrorism designed to maintain segregated community standards. But the real victory wasn't Victoria's imprisonment. It was watching our neighborhood heal and flourish once the fear lifted. The HOA underwent complete restructuring with new leadership elected by unanimous consent. Instead of a single president wielding dictatorial power, we established a 5-member board with rotating leadership and transparent financial oversight. All fines and enforcement actions now require majority board approval and follow clearly defined due process procedures. Most importantly, we recovered and redistributed the embezzled funds. Every resident who'd been targeted by Victoria's selective enforcement received full refunds, plus damages for emotional distress. Mrs. Chen used her settlement to expand her garden into a community meditation space. Mr. Washington donated his refund to a veterans organization that helps military families transition to civilian life. The changes extended beyond financial restitution. We rewrote the community standards to eliminate subjective enforcement and cultural bias. Grass height limits were expanded to reasonable ranges. Decorative guidelines now explicitly protect cultural and religious displays. Political expression is protected within broad free speech parameters. Children's toys and recreational equipment are welcome in yards designed for families. We also established a community ombudsman position, currently filled by retired Judge Patterson, to review any enforcement actions and protect residents from future abuse of power. The transformation amazed me. Once residents stopped living in fear of arbitrary punishment, the community became more vibrant, more welcoming, and ironically, more beautiful than Victoria's rigid conformity had ever achieved. People began talking to neighbors instead of avoiding eye contact. Kids played in yards. Without fear, their toys would generate citations. Gardens bloomed with personal expression rather than regulatory compliance. Detective Martinez's investigation had ripple effects throughout our county. Her documentation of the fake officer scheme led to new legislation protecting residents from HOA overreach and requiring law enforcement verification for any enforcement actions claiming legal authority. Other communities discovered similar scams and began investigating their own HOA leadership. The media attention was intense, but largely positive. Our story became a cautionary tale about unchecked authority in residential communities, and the importance of residents standing up to bullies disguised as community leaders. I gave several interviews emphasizing that my position as police chief wasn't what defeated Victoria. It was community members supporting each other and refusing to accept intimidation as normal. On a personal level, the experience taught me valuable lessons about leadership and community engagement. I'd tried to keep my professional and personal lives separate, but that separation had allowed Victoria to terrorize my neighbors while I remained oblivious to the scope of her abuse. Now I'm more engaged with community issues, using my law enforcement experience to help residents understand their rights and protections. I also learned that sometimes the best way to serve and protect is simply by being a good neighbor who refuses to tolerate bullies. Last month, we held elections for the HOA board positions. The campaign was refreshingly civil, focused on practical improvements like playground upgrades, community Wi-Fi, and neighborhood watch programs. Mrs. Chen was elected treasurer, bringing her accounting background and unshakable integrity to financial oversight. Mr. Washington became security coordinator, organizing legitimate community safety initiatives with actual law enforcement cooperation. I was elected to the communications position, helping neighbors understand their rights and stay informed about community decisions. No more secret enforcement actions or surprise citations. Everything happens with transparency and community input. Victoria occasionally sends letters from prison claiming she was unfairly targeted and that the neighborhood has descended into chaos without her leadership. The opposite is true. Property values have increased as word spread about our inclusive, well-managed community. Young families are moving in specifically because of our reputation for fairness and community engagement. The children playing in my backyard right now are growing up in a neighborhood where cultural diversity is celebrated, where kids can be kids without fear of citations, and where adult disagreements are resolved through conversation rather than intimidation. As I watch Mr. Washington teaching the Martinez boy how to flip burgers while Mrs. Chen shows Sarah Connor the proper way to water seedlings, I'm reminded that the strongest communities aren't built through fear and conformity. They're built through mutual respect and shared commitment to making everyone feel welcome. Victoria Collins tried to use fake law enforcement to control her neighbors through fear. Instead, she united us in ways that genuine community leadership could never have achieved. Sometimes the best justice isn't what happens in courtrooms. It's what happens when good people decide they won't live in fear anymore and work together to build something better. The block party is winding down now, but the community we've built is just getting started. And next year, when we celebrate again, it'll be even better because we'll have another year of neighbors who chose cooperation over control, inclusion over intimidation, and community over conformity. That's a victory worth celebrating.